So this is, I think, class number 14 on the Golden Doves. Forgive me if I'm mistaken about the number. Nevertheless, it is Yod Zayin Av Tafshin Peh. So let's read in the Golden Doves, in the introduction, Roman numeral 17. So we were discussing about the relationship between the oral and the written law, the Torah Shebe'al Peh and the Torah Shebichtav. And what we said was that the Torah Shebe'al Peh is the interpretor system, and the Torah Shebichtav is the interpreted system, right? So that there is a semiological relationship between the Torah Shebe'al Peh and the Torah Shebichtav that's fundamental, meaning in order to properly read the Torah Shebichtav, you need to have the Torah Shebe'al Peh. Without the Torah Shebe'al Peh, you cannot read the Torah Shebichtav. This is a subject I speak about in a forthcoming article. Let's say, for example, you have a story by Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe wrote horror stories. Let's say a person, an Italian, who doesn't speak a word of English, takes a dictionary, and he opens up one of the stories of Edgar Allan Poe, The Black Cat. He knows the meaning of all the words because he has an Italian-English dictionary, English-Italian dictionary. So he translates the lexical meaning of each one of the words, and he says, I understand the story. And the story, The Black Cat, which actually is a horrifying story, actually quite gruesome and grisly, he says it's a comedy. He understands it as a comedy. Well, that's his interpretation of the story. But that's an illegitimate interpretation of the story, because in this case, the story was written for a particular audience. Who is a particular audience that the story was written for? It was written for that audience that is interested in horror stories. And by interpreting the story outside the context of the author reader relationship, you're violating both the text. Well, actually, three things. You're violating the text, you're violating the author, and you're also violating the reading public. So, not every interpretation is a possible interpretation. Similarly, the Torah Shebichtav was written for the public that has the Torah Shebe'al Peh. Without the Torah Shebe'al Peh, you cannot interpret the Torah Shebichtav. And to try to interpret the Torah Shebichtav independently of the Torah Shebe'al Peh is a violation of the text. It's a violation of, or disrespect to God, and it's a violation or disrespect of the Jewish people for whom the Torah Shebichtav was written. That's such a fundamental point. Let's continue, because it's going to be we're going to have a lot to say about that particular subject. But continuing now, this type of relationship cannot be inverted. The interpretor system cannot be interpreted by any other system. That's such an important point. So you have the Mishnayot. The Mishnayot come to interpret the Torah Shebichtav. The Mishnayot don't have an interpretor system. You don't need a lay mental to understand the Mishnayot. The Mishnayot is the lay mental, right? So you can't say now, for example, that the Mishnayot is going to become an interpreted system and something else will be the interpretor system. Accordingly, Spanish-speaking Sephardim designate the oral law, lay mental law, since it is representative of the cultural and hermeneutical codes of the Jewish people. So this is very interesting. Among the Sephardim who understood these notions very well, when I say Sephardim, I mean primarily, and I believe my father meant primarily, but not exclusively, Chachmei Andalus. Because Chachmei Andalus were the continuation of the Chachmei HaGemara. And not all the Chachamim were continuation of Chachmei HaGemara. Nevertheless, Chachmei Andalus were the Talmidim of the Geonim, who were the Talmidim of Chachmei HaGemara. So there was a continuous chain, a continuous Masoret. That's fundamental. That's fundamental to understanding Torah, to understanding Gemara, to understanding Mitzvot. Nevertheless, so when he says Sephardim, they had the idea of the lay mental, the mental law, because the Torah Shebe'al Peh is a mental law. That's the way we think. In other words, when you tell somebody you have to have some sort of sign on your arm, though if you speak to an American, it's like, what are you talking about? Are you saying I should put a tattoo on my arm? Like, what? Like, you mean those stickers that they stick on you when you enter a party, and they have like a little red sticker on your hand so you can walk in and out? Well, what do you mean by that? So a Jew who has a lay mental understands the sign that we have on the arm is a tefillin. The reason we understand this is because we studied the notion of signs, of otot, with Moshe Rabbeinu in Ohel Moed, and the lessons of Torah that we had with Moshe Rabbeinu in Ohel Moed. They affected our mental apparatus. They structured our mental apparatus. So any Jew reading automatically understands, oh, it's talking about tefillin. We know it's talking about tefillin. That's the lay mental. And the lay mental is our culture. The lay mental is our hermeneutical code. How do we interpret things? How do we view things, right? Right? So, for example, for a goy, seeing a black cat, oh my gosh, that's bad luck. For a Jew, seeing a black cat is a nuisance at most. I mean, it's just, scram. Unless you're a cat lover. But the point is, so there's a particular interpretation of the world, interpretation of text. How do you interpret text? What is a legitimate interpretation of text? So the lay mental tells that to us. Yod Gimal Midot She'Torah Nidreshet Bahem. That's a lay mental, right? So that's a hermeneutical code, which is part of the lay mental. The oral law is the interpretation of the scripture. Wow, how fundamental. Again, the oral law, the Torah Shebe'al Peh, is an explanation of the Pesukim. But people think, explanation, okay, so like I have like a dictionary. I'm reading Monarch Notes, which has a commentary. It's not a commentary. It's a natural explanation. When I say natural explanation, I mean to say that the Torah Shebe'al Peh is not just an essential interpretation of the Torah Shebe'al Peh. It's more than that. It's a mashal I think my father uses. I'm sure my father uses later on in this book. My father told me many times. So you have the ocean. In the ocean, you go to Antarctica. To the Arctic Circle. You have icebergs. You also have icebergs in Antarctica. Nevertheless, you have these icebergs floating around, and you see the iceberg. So the iceberg exists, but the iceberg exists because under the iceberg, hidden there, is a huge mountain of ice, which is much, much larger than the iceberg that you see above the water. So the relationship between Torah Shebichtav and Torah Shebe'al Peh is a relationship between the iceberg that you see above the water and the mountain of ice, which is under the water. The Torah Shebichtav is like the iceberg. It's the external manifestation of the Torah Shebe'al Peh. So it's not just that the Torah Shebe'al Peh is like a commentary of the Torah Shebichtav, as if although we had the Torah Shebichtav, we wrote the Torah Shebichtav, and after we wrote the Torah Shebichtav, let's write the Torah Shebe'al Peh that explains the Torah Shebichtav as we understand it. No, that is incorrect, albeit that's the explanation that most people understand. No, that is incorrect. Rather, we studied Torah with Moshe Rabbeinu in Ohel Moed for 40 years. That studying that we did with Moshe Rabbeinu structured our minds, that it shaped our mind, it shaped the way we think, it shaped the way we view the world around us, it shaped the way we view the historical episodes that happened to us. And then when we got the Torah Shebichtav, we understood what the Torah Shebichtav is, because the Torah Shebichtav, it came, of course, milah b'milah, word for word, from HaKadosh Baruch Hu to Moshe Rabbeinu. But that Torah Shebichtav was the manifestation or the crystallization of the Torah Shebe'al Peh that we already had. So when we say that we interpret the Torah Shebichtav in accordance with the Torah Shebe'al Peh, well, yes, that's because the Torah Shebe'al Peh is where the Torah Shebichtav comes from, in a sense, right? So we had the lay mental, we received the lay mental. It changed our thinking and our culture and our interpretation of text and our hermeneutical code. And then from that Torah Shebe'al Peh comes the Torah Shebichtav, which crystallizes in a text, in a written text, and the significance of what it means that it's a written text later on. In a written text, our lay mental. And then the lay mental, of course, is the interpretation of the Torah Shebichtav. For that reason, so I think that's just such a fundamental point. I see this footnote 30. Give me a moment while I go. Okay, yeah. All right. Let's continue. It cannot be equivalent to the true Torah, declared to Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas, one of the foremost rabbinic authorities of the Iberian Peninsula. So the Torah al Peh doesn't equal the Torah, right? Right, so the Torah Be'al Peh, it doesn't equal the Torah. It's the interpretation of the Torah. It's the mental mindset that the Jewish people, it's a mindset that the Jewish people have, which enables them to understand, to read the Torah, to interpret the Torah. That's not Torah, right? So for example, you have the Morse code, and then you have the interpretation of the Morse code. The interpretation of the Morse code, so if you have like a series of dots and lines and however the Morse code works, which I'm not quite sure precisely, right? That the letters, that the dots and lines and dashes, they come out to particular letters. And so now if you have the Morse code, right? The Morse code is interpreted by whatever that series of dashes, you have like that table on the side which says 2 dashes means the letter B. I don't know, 1 dash means the letter A. Completely incorrect, but it's not the point. My point is not how to interpret Morse code, but there's a table that tells you how to interpret the dashes and the beeps in the Morse code. So the Morse code is not equal, or those dashes is not equal to the Morse code, right? The Morse code is its own system of communication. So then, the same way that the Morse code doesn't equal that table, and whatever the words come out, there is a storm, a blizzard, 10 miles to the north of Kansas City. Whatever people used to send telegrams about. So the Morse code is not is interpreted by that system, but that system doesn't replace the Morse code, right? That's so important. So that's what the Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas is saying. It cannot be equivalent to the true Torah. So once you say a blizzard is 10 miles to the north of Kansas City, moving south, at the rate of 20 miles an hour, right? Telegram, right? Those verbal communication, that verbal communication is not equal to the Morse code. The Morse code is what it is. Beep, 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 right? That's the Morse code, right? Once I interpret the Morse code, right, you don't say that the interpretation now is the Morse code. No, it's not. It's a different system of language, a different system of communication, right? So in the same way, the Mishnayot is not the true Torah. The true Torah is the Morse code, right? The text of the Torah, the words of the Torah that are written down, that's the Morse code. So once you have the Torah Shebe'al Peh, it's not that the Torah Shebe'al Peh equals and therefore displaces the Torah Shebichtav. No. Neither of the previous contentions is true. The Torah Shebe'al Peh doesn't equal to Torah Shebichtav, and it certainly doesn't replace the Torah Shebichtav. So even once you have the interpretation, the Torah Shebichtav has its own independent existence. Why is that so important? Why is that so important? Because till today, we can read the Torah Shebichtav and we can make Hidushim on the Torah Shebichtav and the Pesukim, because every time there's an interaction between that written text and the reader, that interaction generates meaning. And if you say that the Torah Shebichtav doesn't exist anymore, then why would I read the Torah Shebichtav? I don't need it anymore. It's been displaced by the Torah Shebe'al Peh. No, that is incorrect. It has not been displaced by the Torah Shebe'al Peh. It exists, and therefore the reader, the Jewish reader, can read it and generate meaning from the text. That's why it continues to exist, and that's what Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas meant, and that is the brilliance of this book, that it takes a statement from Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas and it brings it forward using the tool of contemporary linguistics, and it shows the brilliance of that statement, and this is also the brilliance of the book, that it interprets that statement of Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas in such a sophisticated, intelligent manner. So again, I'm reading it again. The oral law, is the interpretation of the scripture. It cannot be equivalent to the true, that is original Torah, declared Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas, one of the foremost rabbinic figures of the Iberian Peninsula. As you all know, Rabbi Yosef ibn Megas was a Talmid of the Rif, and he was the teacher of the Rabbi Maimon HaDayan, or contemporary of the Rabbi Maimon HaDayan, the father of Rambam. right? So they say Hanuman was a Talmid of Rabbi Yosef ben Megas, to the extent that he was a very young Talmid. The most authoritative collection of the oral law is the Mishnah, compiled by Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. Now here's an important thing. The Mishnah is the Torah Shebe'al Peh, right? It's a compilation of the Torah Shebe'al Peh. It's an authoritative compilation of the Torah Shebe'al Peh, right? So that's important because there was a point in time, namely before the Mishnah was compiled, that there was no Mishnayot. There was told Torah Shebe'al Peh. So what is that? What is that about? What is the relationship between the Mishnah and the Torah Shebe'al Peh? How does that work? We will see. Mishnah means text, formulation, right? So the Mishnah, the word Mishnah means text or formulation. This term is connected with the biblical obligation to transmit the words of the Torah to the children. Vishinantam lebanecha, right? So shinantam, Mishnah, Shana, Mishnah. So Shana is when you have a fixed, precise text. You can't change that text. You must repeat it exactly and precisely as you heard it from your teacher. That's what it means, Shana, Lishnot, or Mishnah. Mishnah is that precise text that was received and that is transmitted in its precise formulation. Right. This, accordingly, it is not an intransitive verb denoting a reflexive action. Right? All right. So Mishnah is not something. It's not transitive. You don't do it to yourself. You're shoneh something else. Namely, you're shoneh a text. You're repeating a text. You're transmitting a text. Right? Mishnah derives from the root shana, shin, nun, he, meaning both change and transmission. So you transmit, but every time you transmit, there's a Talmid who's receiving the transmission, and he has a mind, which is the mind of the new generation, and he processes the Mishnah, but he processes it slightly differently, as we all process, and as we all process what our parents teach us slightly differently because we have a different brain. So our brain receives the information. Our brain is not just a tape recorder, but it processes the information, and then we have a certain understanding of the information. Do you remember what this book is about? The tension between articulation and ideality? Well, there you have it. The Mishnah, Shana. Every time you transmit a halakha, a precise text, it's understood, but it's changed a little. So that's just the nature of the human mind. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no tragedy in that, right? Articulation or formulation. Of course, I know many of you think, oh my gosh, that's a horrible tragedy. It's because you think platonically. So in Plato you have these ideas. You have the horse, and all other horses are inferior replications of that horse. So if you feel that sense of tragedy, oh my gosh, we changed it mentally. Our understanding, not the text, by the way. Oh my gosh, that's tragic. Well, no, it's not, because by nature, you're not the same as your great-great-grandparents who lived wherever they live, whether it's Morocco or Damascus or wherever it is. And naturally, the way you process reality is different than the way they processed reality, right? It's part of human development and intellectual development and evolution and going forward. So the way our grandchildren will process it will be slightly different. Remember the famous story of Honi HaMa'agel, who wakes up 70 years later and he comes to the Bet Midrash and he's completely irrelevant? Do you remember that story? Yes, that's the point of Shana. Exactly. That's the point of Shana. So Mishnah derives from the root Shana, meaning both change and transmission. Articulation or formulation is a transitive action effected through a change which makes transmission possible. So articulation or formulation is a transitive action. When you articulate a Mishnah, you're doing something to a text. You're articulating the text, right? And it's so therefore it's transitive because you're doing it to something else. Or formulation. If I formulate a Mishnah, Rabbeinu HaKadosh, when he first formulated the Torah Shebe'al Peh, so he formulates the Torah Shebe'al Peh, and in a sense he changes it, because now it's reduced to a particular text, right? So articulation or formulation is a transitive action effected through a change, which makes transmission possible. And that's the only way you can transmit. The only way you can transmit is by articulating, by formulating, and ultimately by changing. And then when the mind of the student captures it, he will reprocess it and will change it. So the text is set, the halachot are set, the mitzvot are set. I mean, with the exceptions of whatever dinim muflaim, gezerot, tekanot, we say Moshe Rabbeinu. But there is that idea of shana, fundamental, and with this, we will wait till our next class.